Going through the academy, you learn a lot about policing. You learn about the way that criminal justice works, and you learn about criminal law. You also learn very much about honor, integrity, respect. If you have similar trainings like I did, you learn about how difficult the job could be, and you also learn a lot about why that job is so important. So then you get out into the real world, and you might enjoy it, or you might be somebody who feels like maybe the job isn't quite what it even with all the training. You feel like maybe some of the things that you were told in the academy don't really match up with what you actually do at your job. You feel like maybe you don't about the brother that you're about. That is something that we do, or something seems like you are giving it, or you know, I realize that a lot of that are talking about is just leads to everything trying to melt by. And you only understand you should not get more shit. You might not fully understand why it's important to be very particular. And yet, such also be very forgiving. And you that try is often not your job. Maybe you understand. Maybe you have really having a maybe you just been kind of dealing like you have. And I think this causes a lot of confusion with how the public views police. Um, there are two things that about this. Being times when people don't like police, and the police would react by simply saying that they were criminals or that they were people who just didn't want to like them, but they didn't like them for very political purposes. That is something that's going to come up again later. Um, the second thing is a funeral that I attended a few years ago of a buddy of mine that died of heart failure. That my sheriff's office had a had their own funeral service for him. Uh, at the time, I was on mental health leave for very serious personal issues, and I remember kind of fully understanding why um, I was ready to be done with it. Why I didn't like, even though I was in the jail, I had no desire to be a patrol officer. I had no desire to be, and the only reason why I even considered doing it is out of pure financial necessity. Um, at this funeral, there was already a different funeral for the family that they held privately that they've kind of already had them mourn. This was purely for the sheriff's office that he worked out. Um, and this was the first sheriff's office, the first and only sheriff's office funeral I actually ever attended. Um, it was very difficult for me, but it was difficult for me for reasons that shouldn't have been because it was a very hard loss. Because while I should have been mourning, or while I should have been acknowledging that he had died, a friend of mine whose number I recently realized was still on my phone, and I had to delete well over a year later. Um, it was kind of surprising to me, and it was very sad to finally delete it. I kept it for way too long, not realizing it. And I remember just how many people were there, how much attention was paid to it, and how impersonal it really felt. It didn't feel like a proper time of mourning, and I couldn't really verbalize it until I saw somebody kind of explaining why the whole modern day funerals that we have is kind of overly depressing, and it doesn't it kind of involves this sort of weird toxic positivity. I think the sheriff's office politics on top of that, which really bothered me a lot too. um, this need to overly present as overly professional, over the top, and present for the sake of being there. The amount of people that were there, uh, that was sucking up to command staff, the amount of people that were there who were hyper careerist, um, because funerals are a perfect time and a place to meet people and network yourself, and show your face and show how much, show the agency just how good of a boy of a deputy you have to be. It really bothered me. Of all the people that gave speeches about the person, three of them, from what I remember, I could be mistaken, knew him. The other two, I don't even know if they knew him. Um, one of them was his boss. One of them was somebody who kind of knew him and was just trying to tell some funny stories, and it was very awkward. And there was one person that was a really good friend of his who you she was one of the few people in the entire building that you could really feel that this was a loss for. It was a very emotional moment, and it was very hard for me to see her cry. Um, but I knew she needed to, and I try not to judge about it. But in environments like that, you're kind of expected not to cry, or you're not expected to be too emotional. And it was very weird how emotionally disconnected everybody in that room was, and it made me realize why I really felt the need to leave. Um, and it certainly made me realize that I will never want to die in a uniform and have a funeral that is pure for the political purposes of an agency rather than the mourning of my family. Um, and opportunity for people to network. Again, I'll be that, so it's not like really much, if that were to happen. But it was very, um, it was not a good time period for me to see that because I was already very heavily disillusioned, and it furthered that pretty badly. And while I do still harbor a good bit of anger over many of the things that I dealt with, I do think I have a lot of knowledge. A lot of it you probably already know, or you could easily find other people talking a lot better about it. But I think it would be better to hear it from somebody who wore uniform, who might be able to kind of explain things in a way that makes sense and why it's important. Uh, so first and foremost, any honest person that talks to you while you're in a, or to be ready, to actually love you. If having this, they are uh, maybe a little deluded about their own job, or maybe they're just not really self-aware. But if we're not friends with the public, the way you engage with the public is very different. You're a constant representation of the agency that you are, and your individualism is stripped a little bit because what you say has to constantly cater to how it reflects upon everybody else, uh, which can make it very difficult if you have controversial opinions. Otherwise, you have to shut parts of yourself down, and you have to worry about what your real job is. Your real job is two things. Part of the funeral thing problem with, the many things that I had a problem with was because I was heard a random noise. It was your job is primarily two things. It is making arrests, obviously, and it is making sure that the public has as good of a perception or whatever support you can garner, while still being able to do your job mostly. It means not being too honest. If that if that means that you get that being too transparent will take away trust from the public. It means not daring to speak publicly about things. It means not having too much integrity. It makes the agency look bad. It means not uh, being able to fully make decisions on your own, unless if it is well within your discretion and it is completely irrelevant to your leaders how it makes them look. Public perception is a big part of your job. One thing that a lot of people have not is defunding the police. You, as somebody who wants to enforce it, might be very confused as to what people are saying. If you are confused, I'm letting you confused. However, I do think it is important to understand that your confusion comes from your training, comes from your conditioning, comes from the fact that you can't really afford a lot of questioning about your own job, and a real lack of personal knowledge of the position that you're currently in. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that your job is necessary or that you are a bad person for doing it. You should perfectly avoid or do that. Me not deal with personal risks and personal issues and a personal need that outweigh my desire to have a positive impact in that field. It was and currently is possibly a potential feeling that may go away one day, but it may not. And it is very personal, and it should not, in by any means, dissuade you from doing it. However, it should make you very aware of why people think very negatively about you. First and foremost, every single thing about your job, every single thing about people not liking you, every single thing that has a bad public perception of you, is because there is an officer's name attached to an action that is relevant to people having a problem with you doing it. Just because you have good intentions does not mean that everybody else that does the same thing as you has good intentions. And that ruins legitimacy. It takes one officer to ruin the legitimacy of many other officers, which is why it is such a big problem for officers to do things in bad faith, because that means that you have less credibility by proxy and by association. You do not get to say that you are a brotherhood and that you and all law enforcement officers everywhere are brothers and sisters, and then also get to have the rugged individualism and the individual decision making whenever that trust is broken. You have to take a little bit. Part of the reason why it is very hard for police to build public respect is because there is a sincere lack of commenting, inconvenient facts, and there isn't a whole bunch of transparency when it comes to things that makes the agencies look bad. Part of it's because of investigations that you don't want to have commentary too early. Part of it is because you need to have good public perception, and you shouldn't always. Anybody who has any sort of political bone in their body will tell you that you probably shouldn't be forthright about your mistakes so much that people lose faith in you. And part of that has resulted in you losing a good bit of legitimacy. The second part of your job is another reason why, well, actually, it's a multitude of reasons why so many people are mad at you, or why you feel as though so many people are mad at you or do not like you simply by your uniform. Part of it is true when your trainers do tell you that you are the worst part of people's days. You are the reason why people go to jail. Jail and prisons kind of ruin people's lives a good bit. They kind of are the result of their own mistakes. Yada yada yada. You're kind of the bearer of bad news, so you kind of have to already start the position off as not being liked, which is why they talk so heavily about de-escalation and being very self-aware with what you were saying to suspects and victims. All that is true. I don't want to deny that you are starting from a position where people are not going to like you, even if you are right. You have to be able to make peace with that. Even even if you do everything correctly, even if you have the best intentions, you have to accept that people will not like you. However, and this is kind of another thing, making arrests also means a lot of the time, actually, I would argue most of the time, arrests tend to happen when they are I don't want to say easiest, but when probable cause can be established. If you do not know what probable cause is, you should not be a part of this conversation. Um, when probable cause can be established is when you can make an arrest. Sometimes that means that you have better probable cause for some arrests than others. And there are some charges and crimes that uh, reflect a sort of incompetency on the part of police. Murders, uh, police have gotten better about it in recent years. However, rape still can kind of be pretty iffy to the point to where it is very genuinely hard to tell, uh, to objectively prove rape a lot of the time. And so you have very bad statistics when it comes to that. It is so easy, especially when you have very convenient tools like radar and lidar, to prove that somebody's speeding. So much so that laws have had to have been made to, in a lot of states, to prevent you from giving people tickets or arresting them too quickly for minor traffic violations. What happen frequently, the tickets do. And so you have more regulations, but you also have an easier burden of proof. So it is almost a guaranteed ticket, and it is almost a guaranteed conviction a lot of the time because it is easy for you to get that conviction. Now, things kind of tend to fall in the path of least resistance. And what that means is that it is easier for you to arrest somebody who steals from a store, and that store has multiple video cameras, and they have a loss prevention team, and they have all this paperwork already done, and they have this excuse for everything written out. They've basically done your reports for you. They have the camera footage for you, and they have the guy already in handcuffs or in an office with a verbal confession in some cases. Your job's already done for you. So when stores have somebody stolen from them, which is why I get personally pissed off whenever Walmart and all these other stores complain about theft, a theft epidemic, people don't realize that they police it, and they've thrown they are perfectly willing to throw more money for a whole separate conversation at it, to the point to where it is very very easy for police to make an arrest. However, I let's take my house for example, my apartment. I have no cameras. I have little to no um, ways of proving for you if somebody were to break into my apartment and steal something. Maybe a broken window, maybe a broken lock. There might be evidence of the theft, and hopefully, my renter's insurance might be able to cover that if the insurance doesn't try to weasel its way out of paying me or reimbursing me anything because I don't have a receipt for everything, and that's a whole separate issue again. However, unless if somebody else happens to have noticed that somebody was suspicious and gotten a license plate, and you're able to track that license plate back to somebody else, or if that somebody has a string of thefts and they happen to where it's easy to where they have been caught. Normally, it's when they go to stores and they steal something. To the point to where honestly, it's really good that they steal from stores because at least then you can actually get very easy evidence to arrest them. That's normally when you find a bunch of shit that they've stolen from other people in stores. Um, it can really feel like to an individual that you're not doing your job because what are you supposed to do when there's obviously a case that somebody has been stolen from, but there's not really an easy way to prove it. You can try to do this for fingerprints, but how much time are you really going to spend on somebody's personal belongings, especially if they have a residence or they have some sort of means of proving that they've been stolen from, and maybe there's some sort of civil case that can be proven later, but it all kind of falls on the wayside to the point to where unless if you have a very sophisticated police department, it's kind of hard to act. What people are feeling like is they've been feeling like they've been giving you a shitload of money, and a lot of your effort tends to go towards businesses. It does not help that the vast majority of your part-time jobs are for private businesses, churches, and for school events to pay the individual officer an exorbitant amount of money while the taxpayers are still paying for the police vehicles and the gas and anybody else and anything else that might have to come up that doesn't come out of your own personal expenses, so that you can make $70 an hour working being an overpaid security guard. Um, it really takes away from legitimacy. Uh, it also has been on part the failure of society. Society has failed you as a police officer. And it's, in particularly, the Conservative Party has failed you as a police officer. And instead of actually solving societal problems, what they want to do is they want to shove a police officer everywhere that they see a problem and then make people feel safer because there's a cop there. Of course, some people don't feel comfortable around cops, and of course, a lot of those people are criminals. But police officers want to get convictions. And so your job is when you see a crime, you're supposed to enforce the law. When people are doing things, or when people accidentally violate the law, or when people aren't really sure what is legal or what is illegal, or when people have a general anxiety, they get stressed when they see you. And your own training should tell you this because your very presence is a show of force. Your very presence commands a certain set of authority. Your very badge commands a set of authority to where even if you personally do not have authority or are not an intimidating person, the consequences of not listening to you vastly outweighs uh, any sort of perception they may have. So even if you are not some sort of super ultra alpha male person, does not matter. There are plenty of police officers that would show up and kick the shit out of anybody who disagrees with you. And that is what most people are terrified of, is because they don't want to be perceived as somebody who disrespects you, which is why a lot of people show an overwhelming and over the top respect to the point of insincerity. And that makes it to where sometimes you tend to have a false perception about yourself. You think people like you because you're doing a necessary job, when in actuality, you're not realizing how scared they are of you. And that makes it to where you and the people who tend to support you the most, the conservatives, can be pretty tone deaf. That is the reason why whenever you have a public opinion, it is much easier to have a conservative public opinion than a liberal public opinion, because conservatism has favored policing so much that it almost is viewed as something. It's kind of one of those unwritten rules that is never directly stated, but it's kind of an enforced norm, conservatism, amongst policing. This has made it to where people who have political ideologies that disagree with conservatism will naturally have a problem with you because they view you in association with a political party that doesn't actually care about you. They only care about using you to their means. And again, you are the victim in this. However, it is constantly perpetrated because the money and the funding and the public perception constantly outweighs the possible and very hard to measure negative influence that it gives onto you. Another way of looking at this is because the path of least resistance tends to go to people who can't afford to have personal cameras, who can't afford to basically do your job for you, and because your call volume increases to the points to where those are where your most of your arrests comes from, because it's easier to arrest 5 people who have stolen from stores who have been pulled into the office of the loss prevention, and it's all in the same mall, and you can just take them all to court over and over and over again, versus spending that much time or even more time investigating a relatively more minor theft, or one that is much more personal that only affects one person. Again, path of least resistance. So poor people feel as though they pay you to not really protect and serve them. All of this is made worse because you have an incentive to make arrests. Arrests make you look good, and arrests keep numbers up, and it keeps your funding up. To the point to where you have to kind of admit that police officers will follow somebody for a little bit to see if they can violate a crime. And your own training, or at least most police officers will be honest and admit that it's almost impossible to drive a vehicle without accidentally breaking the law. A slight swerve where you're touching the line is failure to maintain a lane. Going down a hill that's a little bit too steep might make it to where you are speeding beyond the 5 or 10 minute mile per hour above the posted speed limit, to where you can pull them over. It as well as the constant car failures that can happen that you can easily identify, as well as the other things that you can simply say that you saw that you don't necessarily have to prove, like somebody being on their phone. Again, police officers do this in somewhat bad faith, carrying a better number than actually making people understand and like they earned the rest of that speak to or whatever interaction they're having. So that's now is suspicion that are or look for them doing something wrong. And that naturally makes me more paranoid and feel very uncomfortable around you. And out of discomfort, a lot of them come up to me and say, I think you're just doing a really good job. I feel like your job is really hard, blah, 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 because they want to assure you that they're anything wrong. All of this is made even worse with prosecution tactics. Public defenders, the public defender system, the constant plea deals that are offered to people to where people are essentially told that even if the evidence is relatively loose, we're going to offer you a relatively shitty plea deal. But if you don't take it, we can offer you a lifetime sentence. And oh, by the way, we're going to do everything we can to try to keep this from going to court and pressure you into signing a plea deal. And the public defenders kind of not necessarily working with those people, but not having enough time to consider other alternatives, makes it to where people kind of lose faith in criminal justice and in turn lose faith in you a little bit. There's also a lot of other things that that prosecuting attorneys can do. There are plenty of stories and examples, and you might even be able to find your own prosecuting attorney who will admit this to you, where they will just bring a stack of paperwork that is completely irrelevant to your case or is blank, but to make you feel like there's more evidence than there actually is. And that can cause a lot of trauma. That can cause a lot of stress and a feeling of sort of this sliminess that comes in the criminal justice system. It certainly doesn't help that the CIs and the undercover policing that has very little rules, and when it's actually explained to people what happens when police officers go undercover as prostitutes and they're essentially offering sexual activities to people, and then when they say yes, they arrest them, is that you kind of entrapping them? Technically, no, but if you have to use the word technically, are you in a good position? And that's kind of another big problem is when you have to use the word technically, again, it kind of makes people realize that the spirit of the law doesn't matter and it's people arguing over literal words being used. There are also a number of people that will advertise ideologies and products to you and your agency for the low, low cost of a shitload of money or your own personal integrity in some cases. Have a hard time with people making accusations or wanting to build trust with people, buy our overpriced body cameras, where we will have essentially one of the world's largest databases of police body camera footage. And let's essentially make it to where everything you do on the clock is essentially recorded. So that way, even irrelevant actions can be judged by your supervisors, and you can constantly feel cornered in your own job. While people who do a shitty job or do things in bad faith seem to still never get in trouble. This results into a lot of police officers who want to and try to do the right thing, but get to see constantly people do the wrong thing, feel a little bit pissed off and disillusioned by their own jobs, and they wonder, is this more of a popularity thing? Why does this person keep get to keep getting away with these things, but I keep getting bitched at every time I accidentally say a curse word because that might hurt somebody's feelings. Again, it's another access to you as an employee for your supervisors to essentially overcorrect and your profile to you to fit and whatever perception and temperament they want to display to the public. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but it can be overwhelming, especially if you're not used to it. You also have tasers, or as well I like to call them, the most useless piece of plastic you can ever fucking put on your hip, or on your duty belt, or on your vest. An internal study in the agency that I worked for had a statistic that said that tasers worked 50% of the time. Of that 50% of the time, most of the time it was simply pulling it out or doing a spark test as a form of intimidation. Actual connections amounted to around one fourth of the time, and even then, sometimes you didn't even get a full lockup of the body. You just got one prong in, and again, it intimidated the person in cooperation. Other times, when you're trying to tase somebody, it doesn't work. And there's a lot of misinformation that goes with tasers because of this, because you don't realize that a lot of your information about tasers is actually a marketing campaign, as well as a lot of other things that you have on your belt, on your person, or a part of your training program, because training is another thing that can easily be advertised to you. This can make it to where there are experts that are in bad faith, paid by the taser company, which, yes, it is a company, for the term excited delirium. What is excited delirium? It's when somebody randomly dies and there happens to have been a taser involved. And oh, look at that, that person was on drugs. So you technically can't say that the taser caused some sort of cardiac arrest. It was actually just because of the drugs. Or oh, the person was just very stressed out and their heart just got so excited. Don't look at the tasers, look at the person and their individual issues. Again, this has made it to where people have a little bit more bad faith into you. A taser company is not police, however, they advertise specifically to police to the point to where anything that looks bad on these companies looks bad onto you. The same thing goes with flock cameras and Palantir and Peter Thiel. I almost forgot his name. When you're having these flock cameras that actually don't really seem to make your job that much easier, but instead tell you that there's constantly a stolen vehicle, and when you show up, it was a mailbox that it assumed was a license plate, and you have to file a report and waste time, and millions of dollars were spent on this equipment, people are very quick to point at whatever flock camera has caught whatever car and whatever crime as evidence that these flock cameras work and they're absolutely necessary, when in actuality, they cost a shitload of money and they just seem to keep track of everybody and ruin privacy for individual people. Your government has sold out the public for the sake of spying, and a lot of what you have been put to do is you have been put in place in people's privacy, in real situations that should not necessarily call just for somebody who needs to figure out whether or not a law was broken, and things that aren't even necessarily unsafe, but people feel unsafe, so it's your job to make them feel safe. Or some sort of disorganization that requires somebody to take charge and make some sort of organization, like a car crash or some sort of traffic control. Ironically enough, the police advertising is so bad that it's so much easier to talk about any police officer in the country that's been shot. It's very difficult to talk about police officers that got hit by a vehicle by a civilian that wasn't paying attention. And it's so easy to blame that on cell phones when in actuality it's just because a lot of drivers are very selfish assholes. But most police officers will tell you that every other day when they're directing traffic, somebody almost hits them, to a point to where in the state of Georgia they made a move over law to where they can pull you over and they can criminally prosecute you for failing to yield and to move over and leave an empty lane wherever a police officer is acting. Those deaths, no matter how often they happen, aren't as sexy as the police officers that get shot. There's not a criminal that's very easy to point to and say, look at that bad gang member that wanted to shoot you. However, if a gang member wanted to kill a police officer, it's condemned infinitely more than a police officer who died because somebody didn't want to fucking pay attention. When the school shooting happened in Winder, Georgia, and even though I was not an SRO, I was still placed in a school alongside an SRO to provide an additional security. It was not because the school was under any actual threat. It was because the public was very stressed from the news, and the first and gut reaction was to just place another police officer anywhere they could to make people feel safer. Not realizing that more police involvement just made people wonder, hey, did we get a threat? Is that why there's more officers here? Instead of, oh my God, there's more officers. Our county really loves us. Because again, a lot of the politics is very tone deaf. When Donald Trump came to my county, there wasn't just a minor security detail that was involved and worked with the federal government and whatever hired security that Trump had hired. The damn near the entire county was involved to the point to where people were driving around neighborhoods that were nearby but had virtually nothing to do with the whole thing because of the public perceptions and the fear of the media, and because the county just really wanted to show just how good of a boy it was for Donald Trump. Ridiculous, over the top reactions that feel as though placing more police officers in every corner in people's lives instead of getting to the root of issues is the kind of the biggest problem with policing. Again, there's a reason why people will acknowledge how hard your job is, and they will say you have to basically be able to be a lawyer without actually being a lawyer. You have to be a mental health expert without being a health expert or a therapist. You have to be able to give personal advice without actually being qualified to do so. and you have to basically fill all of these roles. But what they leave out is that they're kind of the ones that have done this to you. The basic job of police officers is to find laws that are broken, investigate, use force if necessary to sort of in that process for instead it turns into a political tool where you get to be accessed constantly and you're constantly offered other opportunity for work when in actuality a hired security guard or an actual mental health expert would have sufficed. Society has made it to where your best option as a drug addict is to get caught by a police officer and go to jail and be forced to be sober for a little bit and either go to rehab or face years and years in prison. You're only going to go to rehab because the years and years in prison really look bad, and while you wouldn't pay $10,000 for rehab before, you're perfectly willing to do that to avoid going to prison. Police were put in place of the mental health asylums, which had a lot of problems. However, I don't think it's necessarily a solution, and I think most people would agree to just wait for mentally ill people to accidentally break the law and not fully understand what's happening. And because they can't advocate for themselves, they sit in jail sometimes for years at a time before they actually get sentenced or are deemed ill-equipped to go to court, and then they just get released back out into the public. And it certainly doesn't help when most police officers are trying to portray themselves and portray you as some sort of warrior, some thin blue line that is the difference between society being in complete chaos and society functioning perfectly. Even though most of the peace that you offer is a peace rather than actual peace, because people have your necessary, they never actually had to ask the question why. And again, most people who take these jobs are the same people that join the military. They're the same people that do anything else. It's a government job that has good benefits and sometimes can be a little bit laid back and you can be a little bit lazy at. There's no pressure to provide some overwhelming uh, profit to a boss in the private sector. There's no pressure to constantly cater to customers. You don't necessarily have to be nice to everybody because part of your job is being the worst part of people's day, and you do have to be aggressive a little bit. So again, it's attractive to people who are in financial need and who want a stable job and security. There's a reason why when I was disillusioned at my job, nobody had ever told me, like the people that I had worked with for years, they hadn't told me, hey, there are good things that you're actually doing, and even though it doesn't feel like you're doing good things, you are doing good things. What they instead said is, do you know how much money you make? Do you know how good this job is? Do you know how good of a career opportunity this is? While also constantly advertising to the public how heroic everybody is. This this failure to admit that it is purely a career risk move and it is purely a financial reason why a lot of people do these things is kind of indicative of how dishonest a lot of police propaganda is. Not to mention the fact that constant propaganda, the police shows and the FBI shows and CIS and NCIS and all of these things that contribute to the most unrealistic view of how policing is to the point to where at best people have a Grey's Anatomy understanding, like the same way they have a Grey's Anatomy understanding of doctors. That's the understanding they have of policing. Some minor accuracies with some way overly attractive people, and everybody's just fucking, which actually does happen in a lot of agencies. I will grant that. Just know that if you are feeling any of these things, there is an honest story and a couple of pieces of information that maybe can be acknowledged behind closed doors at your agency, but you can't publicly say. And that people do understand you, and that people don't necessarily not like you. However, a lot of people that you surround yourself with, or rather your agency surrounds yourself with, or some of the supervisors that you might have, just give people really good reasons not to like you. But you're not hated, and you're not a victim. A job that is controversial, and because you are working in controversial, it is normal for people to like you. People understand you, people hear you, and it is important for you to find some form of connection outside of your agency because I promise you, the moment you leave your agency, a lot of those people you sat with who told you that they were going to care about you, they're just going to care about and hang out with other officers because it's just a proximity thing. It's not an integrity thing. It's a time thing. It's a convenience thing. It's a little bit hollow, but you still can do good things, and you still do a lot of good things. You stop a lot of bad guys. You help people solve a lot of their problems, and it's not all bad. However, you do have to be able to acknowledge some of the bad things that does go with your job, so that way you're not at least not surprised about it.